This audio presentation of the Essene Book of Creation by Edmond, Bordeaux, Szekely is brought to you by audioenlightenment.com. Copyright 2014, all rights reserved. Path of Consciousness. There are three paths leading to truth. The first is the path of the consciousness, the second that of nature, and the third is the accumulated experience of past generations which we receive in the shape of the great masterpieces of all ages. From time immemorial, man and humanity have followed all three paths. The first path to truth, the path of the consciousness, is that followed by the great mystics. They consider the consciousness is the most immediate reality for us and is the key to the universe. It is something which is in us, which is us. And throughout the ages, the mystics have made the discovery that the laws of the human consciousness contain an aspect not found in the laws governing the material universe. A certain dynamic unity exists in our consciousness, where one is the same time many. It is possible for us to have simultaneously different thoughts, ideas, associations, images, memories, and intuitions occupying our consciousness within fragments of a minute or a second. Yet all this multiplicity will still constitute only a single dynamic unity. Therefore, the laws of mathematics, which are valid for the material universe and are key to its understanding, will not be valid in the field of consciousness, where 2 and 2 do not necessarily make 4. The mystics also found that measurements of space, time, and weight, universally valid in nature and throughout the material universe, are not applicable to the consciousness, where sometimes a few seconds seems like hours or hours like minutes. Our consciousness is not in space and therefore cannot be measured in spatial terms. It has its own time, which is very often timelessness. So temporal measurement cannot be applied to truth reached by this path. The great mystics discovered that the human consciousness, besides being the most immediate and the inmost reality for us, is at the same time our closest source of energy, harmony, and knowledge. The path to truth leading to and through the consciousness produced the great teachings of humanity, the great intuitions and the great masterpieces throughout the ages. Such, then, is the first path to, or source of truth, as the Essene tradition understand and interpret it. Unfortunately, the magnificent original intuitions of the great masters very often lose their vitality as they pass down the generations. They are often modified, distorted, and turned into dogmas, and all too frequently their values become petrified in institutions and organized hierarchies. The pure intuitions are choked by the sands of time and eventually have to be dug out by seekers of truth able to penetrate into their essence. Another danger is that persons following this path, the path of the consciousness, to truth may fall into exaggerations. They come to think that this is the only path to truth and disregard all others. Very often, too, they apply the specific laws of the human consciousness to the material universe where they lack validity and ignore the proper laws to the proper sphere. The mystic often creates for himself an artificial universe, farther and farther removed from reality, till he ends by living in an ivory tower, having lost all contact with reality and life. The path of nature. The second of these three paths is the path of nature. While the first path of the consciousness starts from within and penetrates thence into the totality of things, the second path takes the opposite way. Its starting point is the external world. It is the path of the scientist and has been followed in all ages through experience and through experiment, through the use of inductive and deductive methods. The scientist, working with exact quantitative measurements, measures everything in space and time and makes all possible correlations. With his telescope, he penetrates into far and distant cosmic space, into the various solar and galactic systems. Through spectrum analysis, he measures the constituents of the different planets in cosmic space, and by mathematical calculation he establishes in advance the movements of celestial bodies. Applying the law of cause and effect, the scientist established a long chain of cause and effects which help him to explain and measure the universe as well as life. But the scientist, like the mystic, falls somewhat into exaggeration. While science has transformed the life of mankind and has created great value for men in all ages, it has failed to give entire satisfaction in the solution of the final problems of existence, life, and the universe. The scientist has a long chain of cause and effect secure in all its particles, but he has no idea what to do with the end of the chain. He has no solid point to which he may attach the end of the chain, and so by the path to truth through nature and material universe, he is unable to answer the great questions concerning the beginning and end of all things. The greatest scientist recognizes that in the metaphysical field beyond the scientific chain there is something else, continuing from the end of the chain. However, there are also the dogmatic scientists who deny any other approach to truth than their own, who refuse to attribute reality to the facts and phenomena which they cannot fit into their own categories and classifications. The path to truth through nature is not that of the dogmatic scientist, just as the first path is not that of the one-sided mystic. Nature is a great open book in which everything can be found, if we learn to draw from all its inspiration which it has given to the great thinkers of all ages. If we learn her language, nature will reveal to us all the laws of life and its universe. It is for this reason that the great masters of humanity withdrew into nature. Zoroaster and Moses into the mountains, Buddha to the forest, Jesus to the desert, and thus followed this second path as well as that of the consciousness. The two paths do not contradict one another, but harmoniously complete one another in full knowledge of the laws of both. It was thus that the great teachers reached wonderful and profound truth which have given inspiration to millions throughout thousands of years. Path of culture. The third path to truth is the wisdom, knowledge, and experience acquired by the great thinkers of all ages and transmitted to us in the form of great teaching, the great sacred books or scriptures, and the great masterpieces of universal literature which together form what today we would call universal culture. In brief, therefore, our approach to truth is a threefold one, through consciousness, nature, and culture. In the following chapters we shall follow this third path leading to truth and shall examine a portion of one of the great sacred books, the Old Testament, taking the early chapters of the book of Genesis which tells the story of creation. There are different ways of studying these great books of humanity. One way, the way of all theologians and of the organized church, is to consider each text literally. This is a dogmatic way resulting from a long process of petrification by which truth are transformed into dogmas. When the theologian follows this most easy by one-sided path, he runs into endless contradictions and complications, and he reaches a conclusion as far removed from the truth as that of the scientific interpreter of these texts who rejects them as entirely valueless and without validity. The approaches of the dogmatic theologian and the exclusivist scientist represent two extremes. A third error is to believe, as do certain symbolists, that these books have no more than a symbolic content and are nothing more than parables. With their own particular way of exaggeration, these symbolists make thousands of different and quite contradictory interpretations of the great text. The spirit of the Essene tradition is opposed to all three of these ways of interpreting the great books of humanity and follows an entirely different approach. The Essene method of interpretation of these books is, on the one hand, to place them in harmonious correlation with the laws of the human consciousness and of nature, and on the other, to consider the facts and circumstances of the age and environment in which they were written. This approach also takes into account the degrees of evolution and understanding of the people to whom the particular master was addressing his message. Since all the great masters had to adapt their teaching to the level of the audience, they found it necessary to formulate both an exoteric and esoteric teaching. The exoteric message was one comprehensible to the people at large and was expressed in terms of various rules, forms, and rituals corresponding to the basic need of the people and to the age concerned. Parallel with this, the esoteric teaching enshrined the complete and perfect expression of the truth for the benefit of those few persons at each period who were sufficiently advanced to receive the whole. These esoteric teachings have survived through the ages partly as written and partly as unwritten living traditions, free from forms, rituals, rules, and dogmas, and in all periods have been kept alive and practiced by a small minority. It is in this spirit of the interpretation of the truth that the book of Genesis will be examined in the following pages. Rejecting the dogmatic method of literal and purely scientific interpretation, as well as the exaggeration of the symbolist, we shall try to interpret the story of Genesis in the light of our consciousness and of nature, and in harmony with the great tradition of the Essene, to whose brotherhood the author of Genesis himself belonged. The first book of Moses, of which Genesis is the beginning, was written in Hebrew and forms part of the canonical scripture adapted by the Church in the first century of the Christian era. However, there is another Hebrew text, the Essene book of creation, which was regarded as apocryphal by the Catholic Church and did not meet with the approval of the synods. In our interpretation, we shall consider the official text alongside the text of the Essene book of creation, and we shall make the necessary comparison. The first chapter of Genesis opens with the words, "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." The Essene book of creation, on the other hand, says something very different. Without beginning, the law creates thought and life. Without beginning, instead of in the beginning, and in place of God, the Hebrew tetragrammaton, which, according to the Essene tradition, means the law. The Essene text has creates in the present instead of created in the past, while heaven is replaced by thought and earth by life or living matter. These opening words of Genesis have been the subject of a vast literature and much controversy. It will, therefore, be worthwhile to consider each word in both the exoteric and the esoteric text. In the beginning. The words in the beginning with which the official texts open are really quite meaningless. They do not mark any concrete period of time, and even if be supposed that they indicate a certain date or point in time, they can not have such a meaning as regards the universe, for this has no beginning. Measurements of space and time can be applied to parts of the universe, but despite its ever-growing knowledge and steady penetration of the cosmic space, science has been unable to discover spatial or temporal limits to the universe. There is the same eternity behind us as lies before us. The existence of the esoteric Essene book of creation, with its use of the expression without beginning, and this text is much older than the Genesis, shows that in the beginning was not the phrase originally used. With all great teachings, there is tendency to bring them down to the level of popular understanding. Since the expression without beginning is not easily understandable by the average person who has not been trained to think deeply, it was changed by the official hierarchy into one readily comprehensible to all. In the beginning. The human brain is trained to think in beginnings. There is a beginning of a day, of a night, of a year, or of a holiday. And all human activities have their beginnings. Therefore the phrase in the beginning is a concession to the stereotypical human mind. But the universe as a whole cannot be measured in terms of beginning. God. The next word in the exoteric text is God. The first chapter of Genesis tells us that God created man in his own image, but history throughout the ages reveals the opposite process, whereby man is continually creating gods. Different peoples at different periods have made idols of manifold shapes which they identified as their gods. Sometimes they held a rock to be a god, or a plant, animal, tree. Sometimes it was the earth itself. Or they believed the sun or moon to be gods, or a certain star or constellation. At other times men had a river for God, or the wind, or the hurricane, or even the ocean. Throughout the ages, man has fallen into the common error of identifying God with manifestation, or giving God a concrete form and limiting the divinity to some concrete natural or artificial thing. Where the word God is used in the Essene book of creation, it is not in any of these senses. In a later age, man created God in his own image and pictured him as a dignified old man with a long beard who lives among the clouds, who thinks as man thinks, gets angry as man gets angry, and punishes and rewards in accordance with his ever-changing mood. It was thought that God was nothing but an oversized man possessing superior power and knowledge. The Essene book of creation does not describe such an anthropomorphic God. Then again, as philosophy and the history of human thought developed, the various metaphysical schools created different gods according to their own reasoning, logic, and imagination. Some metaphysical systems consider God to be power, while others hold that he is love or wisdom or truth. Great philosophers have said that God is nature or the universe itself. Others have held that God is reason. All these philosophical and metaphysical systems fall into the error of identifying God with an abstract, immaterial manifestation. They limit God just as much as the primitive idolatry with its concrete material forms. In its interpretation of God, the Essene book of creation does not limit itself to either a material or an immaterial manifestation. In the ancient Essene text, God is always mentioned in connection with the word law. During the ages, this word has acquired several meanings. At the present time, it unfortunately suggests something quite different to what it meant thousands of years ago. First of all, it means to us some man-made rule or regulation, the edict of a king, dictator, or parliament. Law in this sense is usually different with each age and country. There are also the scientific laws concerning nature and the material universe. These two vary according to the age and progress of humanity. The scientific law of 100 years ago are no longer laws today, and present-day scientific laws will have disappeared a century hence. So what does this mean? It does not mean that the laws of the universe and of life are not the same today as they were 100 or 1,000 years ago, as they will be in the same thousands of years. These laws have the same validity in the past, now, and in the future. It means only that our conception of these laws is constantly changing as our knowledge increases and becomes more and more all-sided. The history of human thought and the history of philosophy and the sciences consist of nothing but a long series of hypothetical laws established by man in the face of the permanently changing aspect of one and the same reality. It is evident that the Essene tradition did not refer either to man-made social laws or to man-made scientific laws when they speak of the law in connection with God. According to the Essene and the great thinkers of all times, the law is everywhere and behind all. There is a law according to which a stone falls, mountains and seas are formed, the sun and the moon move. In accordance with it, earth revolves, solar system arise and disappear, atoms and molecules have their motions. All manifestations of life appear, are transformed and disappear in accordance with the law. And it is thus that ideas, notions, sensation, intuitions, and logical procedure follows one another in endless flow in our consciousness. Everything that exists, concretely or abstractly, materially or immaterially, follow the law. It is this law, behind all and ever present, governing everything, with the Essenes symbolized in their ancient text. By later interpretation, this law was identified with something limited, one-sided, and imaginary. But as originally conceived, it was above all limitations and was formless, as a mathematical equation is formless. It is omnipresent, it is also omnipotent, because all that happens in the universe is governed by this law, and takes place in accordance with it. Still more, it is omniscient, because in it is contained the totality of law which governs all things, and the totality of knowledge and the whole universe, all-sided and unlimited. In a word, this law contains all the qualities and attributes given to God in all ages by all religions and all philosophies and scientific systems. It may be objected that by this interpretation God, the eternal and universal law, is impersonal, too cold and far away. This conception does not fit in with the popular image of a Heavenly Father who is in warm and intimate relation with us, who protects us and helps us in distress, who takes a personal interest in our lives. But such an objection is based on a misconception and failure to appreciate the law in all its fullness. The law is our teacher, telling us everything that we should and must know. It demonstrates to us every day all the truth upon which our lives are based. By teaching us, the law protects us at the same time. It guides us securely through all problems and obstacles, through all difficulties, and always shows us the way and the solution. The law takes an interest in our lives and activities, for it rewards us whenever and wherever we act and live in accordance with it. The law rewards us better than a father, for the law makes no mistake. It is our best teacher, guide, protector. When we deviate from the law, we are punished, as if by a father, and in truth the punishment comes not from the law, but from ourselves. We punish ourselves when we deviate from the law, because the law is good. It is not only omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient, it is also all-knowing. The law loves us even when we depart from it and create our own punishment, and this punishment is not a negative one, but serves a positive purpose and creates a positive value. By our deviation and its consequence, we acquire knowledge and experience, so that through the temporary defeat we create the preconditions for future victory. The law is in us. Everything that happens in our body or consciousness happens in accordance with it. For the law is omnipresent, and wherever we are ourselves manifestations of the law. We are part of it, even as a drop of water is a part of the ocean. The law is a source of energy, knowledge, and harmony for us. We work with it when we become conscious of it, understand, and use it. Such is the law by and through which the Essene express God in their ancient text. Created. The next word in the verse is created. Man has imagined the process of creation in different ways at different periods, but always in a very limited way. Some believe that creation was an instantaneous act performed by a variously interpreted being, an act limited to a certain part of nature or the universe, to a certain part of space and time. Man has always been inclined to think of the creation as a magnified human act similar to the building of a house. But according to the Essene tradition, the creation is continuous and eternal, endless in time and space. It is happening today as it always has happened, and as it will always happen. It is an ever-present and universal process. It is not limited to this planet nor to this planet's inhabitants. Unlimited in time, space, or form, continuous creation is everywhere in the infinite universe. This ancient Essene conception of creation is affirmed by contemporary philosophy and cosmology. Astrophysicists and astrochemistry have shown that there are immense areas in cosmic space where matter is in formation, where at the very moment matter and energy in an infinite variety of aspects are being created. Apart from the material universe, there is a creation continually going on in the human consciousness, independently of space and time. Thoughts are constantly being created. Great musicians are creating symphonies, and great painters are painting pictures which exist in their consciousness, being given material form. The law permanently creates in the human consciousness as well as in the material universe. By working with the law, by being part of the law, we are co-creators with it. Such is the conception of creation found in the Essene book of creation, which was composed much earlier than the first book of Moses. The latter, also written in Hebrew, is the exoteric expression and interpretation of the esoteric Essene book of creation, which itself originated with Moses. The heaven and the earth. From what has already been said, it will be clear that this sentence, the word earth, does not mean only our planet, and that heaven does not mean the sky. As we know from Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, and Sumerian astronomy, the ancient Essenes in general, and Moses in particular, who possessed the astronomical knowledge formed by these traditions, were aware that the earth is not the only planet in the universe. They knew that there are other planets in our own solar system, and innumerable other solar systems in our particular galaxy, and an infinite number of giant galaxies in the infinite universe. It is evident that the Essenes did not limit the continuous creation of the law to our earth, a single small particle of the universe. When they used the expression earth, they meant the sum total of planets existing in cosmic space. Accordingly, they speak of a cosmic ocean of life made up of the totality of living beings on all the life-containing planets in cosmic space. The precise term they used, living matter, is explained by their conception of life and matter. The ancient Essene texts do not draw an essential distinction between organic, living matter, and inorganic matter. In the view of the book of creation, all inorganic matter contains in itself the potentiality of life, and when and wherever the preconditions of life appear, inorganic matter will turn into organic, living matter. Since the potentiality will become a reality, they therefore amalgamated the two expressions, matter and life, into the single term, living matter. By the word earth used in the exoteric text, the Essenes understood the sum total of all planets and of all forms of life on those planets. The Essene book of creation used the expression cosmic ocean of life to designate this totality. Let us turn to the word heaven. By this expression, the Essene did not mean the sky and firmament surrounding our own planet. According to the Essene book of creation of Moses, there is, beside the cosmic ocean of life, another cosmic ocean, which the Essene termed the cosmic ocean of thought. According to their traditions, the thought and currents of thought created by all the dominant races in all the planets form an immaterial cosmic ocean. Just as our consciousness is not material, so our thoughts are not material. The ancient Essenes not only considered living matter to be a cosmic function not limited to our planet, but also regarded thought as a cosmic function not restricted to our planet or to man living upon it. According to the Essene tradition, the currents of thought continuously created by the law through every individual on every planet containing life form a powerful non-material cosmic ocean of thought not limited by time or space. This cosmic ocean propagates a form of cosmic energy with a greater velocity than light, sound, electricity, or magnetism. It represents the most powerful energy in the universe. There is an omnipresent and omnipotent interaction between this cosmic ocean of thought and every thinking being on all planets. This ocean of thought is constantly nourished and enriched by every consciousness, by every thinking being on all planets. And in turn, this cosmic ocean nourishes and enriches the consciousness of every thinking being in accordance with the omnipresent, omnipotent, and omniscient law. According to the Essene book of creation, there is a universal solidity between all forms in life on all planets in the universe and between every thinking being on all the planets. The cosmic ocean of life and cosmic ocean of thoughts form a dynamic unity according to the law, and we are all part of this unity. Such, then, is what the Essene book of creation understands by the word heaven. Without beginning, the law creates thought and living matter. The creation of light, darkness, and the firmament. The second verse of Genesis is the most important and at the same time the most difficult verse in the Old Testament, for it tries to express the inexpressible, to explain what cannot be explained, to make comprehensible the beginning of the beginningless of existence. All the great sacred books of humanity have wrestled with this essential but apparently insurmountable problem. The Rig Veda, the most ancient book of India, deals with the problem in its hymn of creation. Verse: Then was not non-existent, not existent. There was no realm of air, no sky beyond it. What covered in and where? And what gave shelter? Was water there, unfathomed depths of water? Death was not then, nor was there aught immortal. No sign was there, the days and night divider. That one thing, breathless, breathed by its own nature, apart from it was nothing whatsoever. Darkness there was, at first concealed in darkness. This all was indiscriminated chaos. All that existed then was void and formless. Sages who searched with their hearts' thought discovered the existent kinship in the non-existent. There were begetters, there were mighty forces, free action here and energy up yonder. He, the first origin of this creation, whether he formed it all or did not form it, whose eye controls this world in highest heaven, he verily knows it. He fixeth and holdeth up this earth and heaven, giver of vital breath, of power and vigor. End of verse. If we wish to understand this greatest of problems, the beginning of the beginningless, we must not apply the same measure of thought that we generally apply to things limited in time and space. On the contrary, we must try to conceive of things not as finished and completed, but as a reality in permanent dynamic activity, a reality which does not exist but moves and lives. This living reality cannot be made static by constructing a cross-section of it for the satisfaction of the human mind. As soon as a cross-section is made, a limitation is created. We then have something which has ends in time and space, something which never was, like the cross-sections of plants and trees in botanical textbooks. In reality, the plant or tree is in a state of livingness, but when it is cut through and a cross-section is made of it, it is no longer alive. Such a cross-section is only performed for the purpose of examining the details of the plant or tree and of understanding its different static correlations. An analogous principle operates in the problem of the creation. Generally, the great sacred books of humanity try, very often in their first chapter, to explain with limited words to limited minds something that never existed, the beginning of the universe, the beginning of existence, the beginning of the beginningless. They make a cross-section of the reality and present their readers with the maximum that these can understand. The book create a cross-section of the universe in order to provide a means of expression, which will be within the conception of the average mind. Such passages in the great books of humanity must therefore be regarded as concessions made by the particular teacher concerned in an effort to present in a limited and conceivable way that which is inconceivable, the beginning of the beginningless. In order to penetrate into the esoteric meaning of the second verse of Genesis and the lines from the Rig Veda, we shall turn to the corresponding part of the Essene book of creation. The first few verses of this work deal with the origin and evolution of the beginningless and endless spiritual universe, as well as with the origin and evolution of the material universe, and they go on to describe the different cycles of evolution of our planet and of our earthly life. In the Essene book of creation, verses 2 and 3 of the first chapter of Genesis are found, but in reverse order, the sentence, "And God said, Let there be light, and there was light," is generally interpreted by Bible critics who miss the esoteric meaning of the text according to the letter and not according to the spirit. They take the text literally, believing it to refer to optical light, and are consequently led to say that it is nonsense to speak about light before the sun and moon were created. In the Essene book of creation, light has two aspects, and therefore two meanings. First, it is the eternal cosmic ocean of thought, or cosmic consciousness. Secondly, it is human consciousness as an individual part of the eternal cosmic ocean of thought. According to the Essene book of creation, this cosmic consciousness is the foundation of the spiritual universe, and it governs all manifestations of life on all planets in cosmic space. Every thinking body is in inner communion with it. From it manifold currents of thought enter into each thinking body, and towards it tend all the thoughts of all beings and all planets. Such is the light to which the Essene book of creation refers. It is evident that this eternal cosmic ocean of thought preceded the formation of our planet. These first few verses of Genesis and of the Essene book of creation deal first with the spiritual universe and the material universe, and then speak of the formation and evolution of the earth, our planet. The text in the book of creation is very similar to that of Genesis, and the law said, "Let there be light," and there was light. After this comes what is verse 2 in Genesis, "And the earth was without form, and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." Contemporary cosmogony entirely agrees with Genesis that when it began to form, our planet was without form and void. The earth was a part of one of the cosmic nebula, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. Darkness in the Essene book of creation is the absence of consciousness, of thought. In the initial phase of our planet's evolution, there were no living beings of any kind, and consequently no consciousness. Man had not yet appeared. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. All around this formless part of the nebula, which had hardly begun to condense, was the Spirit of God. The eternal cosmic ocean of thought moved upon the face of the waters. But the preconditions of life had not appeared at the early stage of the planet's life and evolution, nor were the preconditions of thought and consciousness present. In other words, there was still darkness upon it. But the eternal cosmic ocean of thought, the Spirit of God moving upon the waters, surrounded this planet in embryonic state. In verse 4 of Genesis, God divided the light from the darkness. In the Essene book of creation, this line appears, and it applies to the whole universe. The same thought and the same words occur in another great sacred book of humanity, the Zen Avesta of Zoroaster. The first chapter of the Zen Avesta speaks of two kingdoms in the universe, the spiritual as well as the material universe, and these are the kingdom of light, Ormuds, and the kingdom of darkness, Ahriman. Ormud and Ahriman are the Zoroastrian terms. The various interpretations of Avistic cosmology made in the West all fall into the same error of considering that the kingdom of light, or Ormud, represents good and the kingdom of Ahriman evil. The Zen Avesta says no such thing. According to it, the kingdom of Ahriman represents nothing but the absence of light, which contains all the preconditions and potentialities of light and will, in a later degree of evolution, become light itself. It is not a question of something evil, but the lack or absence of light, in the esoteric meaning, the absence of consciousness. In infinite cosmic space, there are at all times millions of solar systems and planets in process of formation where the conditions of life, thought and consciousness do not yet exist. In them there is darkness, the absence of light or consciousness. But as soon as a planet attains the degree of evolution where the dominant race appear with their thinking bodies, then the light enters into it from the infinite ocean of ether in the universe. This division of the spiritual and material universe into the kingdom of light and darkness is found not only in the Bible and the Zen Avesta, but in all the sacred books of humanity. When Genesis states that God divided the light from the darkness, it is referring to this basic principle of universal light and to the darkness processing all the potentialities of light and destined to become the light itself. One very important thing is to be noticed. Throughout these first verses of Genesis, there is a reference to water. The waters, the face of the waters, the depth of the waters, the firmament of the waters, the vision of the waters, are a dominant motif running through these 8 verses of the first chapter of Genesis. There is a similar mention of water in the hymn of creation in the Rig Veda. Was water there, unfathomed depth of water? And in another verse, of the time the mighty waters came containing the universal germ. The same paramount reference to water is also found in the first chapter of Zoroaster's Zen Avesta. For what reason do 3 great books of humanity and their respective authors all refer to water when they wish to explain the spiritual and material universe and universal life? One of the oldest Essene traditions uses water in its various aspects and forms of manifestation to explain the complexity and multiplicity of universal life. This tradition is drawn from a very ancient Sumerian source, whence Zoroaster took it from the Zendavesta, the authors of the Vedas for the Rig Veda and Moses for the book of Genesis. Another great teacher, Buddha, used the water to explain his system of thought to his disciples. He declared that the water was one of his teachers. When he wished to compare samsara, the ever-circling flow of life, with that which is uncreated and without end, he likened the various manifestations of life to the waves of the ocean, and to the rivers which appear and then disappear into the ocean, the great water which is always the same. This comparison used by the Buddha is a late echo of the ancient Essene tradition from the Sumerian source, which considered universal life as an ocean, and individuals as waves upon that ocean. Qualitatively, individual life is essentially the same as universal life, of which it is a part. Yet a wave is not the ocean, and the ocean is more than a wave. In all esoteric texts of the sacred books of humanity, material bodies or matter are likened to pieces of solid ice which, in the presence of certain conditions, a change in the external temperature, will be transformed into another kind of life. A piece of ice may not be regarded as lifeless because it contains all the potentialities of living water. When the necessary preconditions appear, it will be turned into water. In the ancient Essene tradition, water is compared to the feeling body. Later, when a further change in the precondition is registered, the water will be transformed into vapor, and this vapor is compared to the thinking body. The ocean of water is likened to the earthly atmosphere of thought, the ice covering the water to material bodies. According to this ancient Essene tradition, there is a single unity of life with various aspects or manifestations. The material body, the feeling body, the thinking body, to which corresponds ice, water, and vapor. It describes how ice is continually dissolving into water, how water is continually being vaporized into clouds. It describes the fall of rain upon the mountains, the flow of little creeks into big rivers, the rivers running into the sea. Then the water is taken up from the oceans into the form of vapor, descends as rain upon the hills, and once again the process is repeated. There is thus a dynamic unity and an endless interaction between the different forms and manifestations of life. In essence, they are all the same. In the ice, the ocean, the rivers, the creeks, and the clouds, they are the same 2 atoms of hydrogen and 1 atom of oxygen. The never-ending process of evaporation and precipitation create the permanent circulation of life in all its manifestation. The Essene tradition likewise explains the correlation between the material body, the feeling body, and the thinking body. It compares the ocean of this planet with the earthly atmosphere of currents of feeling. This atmosphere surrounds our planet and in all the feeling bodies of the individual in permanent interaction. Currents of feeling are continually being created by our feeling bodies. These enter the earthly atmosphere of feeling, from which in turn our feeling bodies receive currents. The clouds represent the earthly atmosphere of thoughts surrounding our planet, to which all the thoughts of the feeling bodies of the planet go, and from which currents of thoughts are received by the feeling bodies. There is permanent, dynamic interaction between all the feeling bodies and this earthly thought atmosphere. After explaining the spiritual universe and the material universe through comparison, the book of Genesis goes on to tell of the different degrees of evolution and of our planet before the appearance of man. Ancient intuition is in complete agreement with contemporary paleontology and geology on this question. Moses' account of the successive stages of evolution tallies exactly with that given by the modern sciences. We must try to visualize the planet in its ancestral form as a fiery, gaseous body covered by vapor and surrounded by the cosmic ether. Life first appeared in the atmosphere between the 2 outer extremes. The intermediate sphere of vapor provided the first preconditioned life, a favorable temperature. The fiery gaseous body was too hot for life and the cosmic ether was too cold. In the vapor-charged atmosphere, the potentialities of life were first translated into a monocellular animal, the amoeba. The life of these primitive amoeba was extremely short. As soon as a current in the vaporous atmosphere carried them down into the extreme heat or up into the extreme cold, they disappeared. At first, the range available to life was very narrow, and the first foothold of organic life on this planet was precarious. Life was limited and short. Yet this amoeba, with its brief existence, had great power. For out of this creation, with a few minutes of life and often unable to divide and create descendants, later appeared the dominant race of man in such giants as Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, Jesus, Leonardo da Vinci, Beethoven, and Shakespeare. Through the workings of the law of life, the jelly-like amoeba gave rise to a series of superior organisms, including a long line of geniuses, who have not only transformed this material planet, but through contact with the great cosmic source of knowledge, harmony, and power have produced great masterpieces of creative thought in every sphere of art and life. If we regard this as a demonstration of the law of what life can accomplish out of so slender a beginning, we shall look for no miracle, for none could be greater than this. The extraordinary operation of the law of life and thought is the greatest demonstration of truth that can be asked for. The miracle is that all the wonder of our world has been wrought by that law with which out beginning creates thought and life. In Genesis we find the expression, the evening and morning of the first day, and so on up to the seventh day. For a clear understanding of these references to successive days, we must turn again to the Essene book of creation. According to this, there were 7 cycles in the evolution of our planet, in each of which a different natural force appeared and began to manifest its activity on the earth. For instance, with the clearing of the vaporous atmosphere, the rays of the sun were able to penetrate the earthly atmosphere and to influence the evolution of life. When the atmosphere cleared still further, water appeared and occupied definite areas of the planet's surface. The air became separated from the water, then vegetation began with grasses, ferns, and eventually trees. In successive evolutionary periods, the different forces of nature entered into action and began to shape the evolution of life. The first chapter of the Essene book of creation describes 7 cycles of earthly life. In each cycle, a new natural force appears, and in commemoration of each cycle, the Essene book of creation describes a form of communion designed to bring its user into contact with the cycle concerned with its corresponding force. The 7 communions matching the 7 cycles and forces are to be made in the morning and are termed the morning communions with the earthly mother. The Essene book of creation describes communions with the sun, with the air, with water, and with natural forces. Parallel with the 7 cycles in the evolution of the material planet are described 7 cycles in the evolution of the earthly atmosphere of thoughts and feelings, which is related dynamically to the infinite cosmic ocean of thought surrounding the planet. According to this conception, each higher degree of material evolution of the planet has its corresponding degree of spiritual evolution of the planet, which is manifested in the earthly atmosphere of feeling and the earthly atmosphere of thought. When and where the infinite cosmic ocean of thought created a certain further precondition of life, and the material evolution of a planetary life was able to develop in turn the capacity to receive this superior cosmic force, increasingly high degrees of consciousness developed on the planet. The Essene book of creation describes the 7 cycles of spiritual evolution on this planet and the 7 spiritual forces which, in dynamic unity and collaboration, presided during the successive cycles. To commemorate these progressively higher degrees of spiritual life, the Essene book of creation describes 7 communions with these spiritual forces, the evening communions with the Heavenly Father. The purpose of the morning and evening communions is to establish contact with the natural and spiritual forces, with the Essenes termed angels, so that they may serve as a source of energy, harmony, and knowledge. By practice of them, a consciousness of unity with them is developed, and man learns to collaborate with the law which governs all things. Such is the esoteric teaching of the Essene book of creation in regard to the 7 days or cycles of planetary revolution referred to exoterically in Genesis. The creation of man. According to the Essene book of creation, the first 6 cycles of the evolution of life on the earth were followed by the law's creation of man, the highest form of life on this planet. In man, the law becomes conscious, and consciousness of the law made man in the image and after the likeness of God. It gave man dominion over every living thing upon the earth. By his possession and manifestation of the law, man became the representative of the Creator upon earth. The exoteric text says that God rested on the 7th day from all of his work which he had made. According to the esoteric text, the law, the Creator, did not rest on the 7th day, but from the 7th day onward. Since the 7th day, man has been entrusted with the work of creation on this planet. According to the Essene version, man was to become co-creator with God, with the omnipresent and omnipotent law which created all the forms of life through the different cycles of the evolution of life on the planet. All was created for man as the Creator's representative on earth. And the Lord formed man of the dust of the ground. Here the Essene book of creation refers to the origin of man's material body. What is meant by the expression, dust of the ground? The dust, at first sight an uncomplimentary term, stands for all the material preconditions of an organism, for all the elements of the planet. And since all living things return to the earth, the dust represents the end as well as the beginning of all material life on the planet. The verse continues, "And breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." The breath of life has a deep inner meaning. In its exoteric sense, it represents the most important precondition of life. Where there is breath, there is life. Where there is no breath, there is no life. According to the esoteric book of creation, breath represents the unity between man and the cosmic oceans of life and thought. The two terms, living and soul, seek to convey this double aspect of the unity of man as a living being with the cosmic ocean of life, unity of man as a thinking being with the cosmic ocean of thought. The fall of man. According to the esoteric Essene book of creation, the Garden of Eden represents the universe in complete harmony with the law, the universe as created by the law. It also stands for the optimum preconditions for the living of man's life. It represents all the perfection of the universe, everything that is given to man in harmony with the law and available to him always, if and when he lives in that harmony. The tree in the Garden of Eden is one of the oldest symbols of humanity and a most important Essene symbol. The Essene tree of life is found carved on Sumerian tiles and stones. It appears in the Zen Avesta of Zoroaster, and it is found as a basic symbol of the Essene Brotherhood at the Dead Sea at the beginning of the Christian era. According to the Sumerian tradition and according to Zoroaster, the tree represents the law itself, while the garden is the perfection of the universe in harmony with the law. The tree of life in the midst of the garden is the ancient Essene symbol of the totality of the natural and spiritual laws and natural and spiritual forces. It is the kingdom which man inherits when he lives in harmony with the law. It will be noticed that in the exoteric text, God does not forbid man to eat of the tree of life. It is only of the tree of knowledge of good and evil that he shall not eat. This is another tree from which, if we eat of it, we shall know not only good, but evil also. The evil is the result of our deviation from the law. Therefore the law, the Creator, bids man not to eat from this tree, since he should know not evil, but only good. The law forbids man to know both good and evil, because it is his destiny to know only the good. Evil has no reality in itself, but man gives it reality of a kind by deviating from the law. In the moment of deviation, he knows good and evil. Even then, his knowledge will not be wholly evil, but a combination of good and evil. Good will be limited by evil. Creating a world of limitation and negation, he loses the Garden of Eden, which is nothing but good, nothing but perfection. Genesis explains how it came about that man preferred the tree of knowledge of good and evil to the tree of life, which is pleasant and good, without admixture of evil. The serpent brings temptation. Now the serpent is an ancient symbol, representing a lower form of existence, a negative factor raising doubt as to the perfection of the law. The suggestion of the serpent represents a negative feeling of the feeling body, a retrogression to the lower degree of life long ago passed by man in his evolution. In the Essene book of creation, man and women are also symbols. Man stands for the thinking body and woman for the feeling body of man. According to that book, man was created in the image of God, his thinking body in the image of divine wisdom, and his feeling body in the image of divine love. The unity of man and woman in the Essene book of creation is the unity of the thinking body and of the feeling body. The serpent's suggestion to the woman is the first deviation from the law. And the woman did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. Eating by the woman represents the reception of a negative feeling, while eating for the man symbolizes the reception of negation by the thinking body. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves aprons. After the first deviation from the law has been made, man sees negation and imperfection where they do not exist. He gives reality to imperfection and imagines them. The degenerative process goes even further. The making of aprons represents the first unnecessary work of man. Since that time, the history of humanity has been nothing but a series of unnecessary works involving a great waste of energy. Wherever we look, around us or into the past, we see a huge quantity of aprons. We see mankind toiling to make multitudes of superfluous things, many of them harmful as well. Man, who might be living leisurely in the perfection of the Garden of Eden, is engaged in the manufacture of all sorts of inferior things as a result of his original deviation from the law. Once the first chain of deviation is formed, all the others follow. And they heard the voice of the Lord God, "Where art thou?" In the midst of the material world of negation and limitation, all of us from time to time hear the voice of God. It asks, "Where art thou, Adam?" And this voice is our salvation. It is a voice that will lead us back to the Garden of Eden, to the tree of life. Since his fall, man has been a triad. The lowest part, the spirit of negation and limitation, is the serpent. In the middle is man with all his potentialities. At the highest part of the triad is God manifested in man, the voice which asks, "Where art thou, Adam?" And the Lord God said, "Behold, the man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now, lest he put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." This is the text as given in Genesis, but the esoteric text of the Essene book of creation diverges considerably from it. And the law, the Creator said, "Behold, the man is not as one of us, since he knows good and evil, and he cannot now put forth his hand and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever." This means that the divine providence wishes man to eat from the tree of life and live forever, and not to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. He should not give reality to evil and create a world of limitation and negation, for he should live in the Garden of Eden, knowing good only. Eventually he will eat of the tree of life in the heart of the Garden of Eden, but not so long as he deviates from the law, giving reality to evil by acceptance of negative feelings in his feeling body and of negative thoughts in his thinking body. Since man cannot serve two masters, the Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground from whence he was taken. So he drove out the man, and he placed at the east of the Garden of Eden a cherubim, and a flaming sword which turned every way, to keep the way of the tree of life. In the esoteric text, the words "flaming sword" are replaced by "flaming light," and the word "keep" by "show." This is an extremely important verse of chapter 3. When man deviated from the law, he drove himself from the Garden of Eden, but his loss is not final and irreparable, since the law, the Creator, placed cherubims or angels in the garden, as well as the flaming light which turns in every direction to show the way to the tree of life. In ancient Essene symbolism, the tree of life, representing the totality of natural and spiritual forces of laws, is surrounded by angels of light who will show man the way back to the tree, so they may eat of it and live forever in harmony with the natural and spiritual laws. The angels round the tree of life derive from the most characteristic of the Essene tradition, angelology, the science concerning angels. They stand for the 7 spiritual powers of the Heavenly Father and 7 natural forces of the earthly Mother. Communion with these 14 angels is the way back to the tree of eternal life. The flaming light of the angels represents the light of consciousness, that consciousness which often speaks to us within when we try and deviate from the law. The law wishes to regain the Garden of Eden, to return to its perfection and claim our inheritance as co-creators with God, continuing to work of creation on his planet. At the center of the Essene tree of life is a human figure. Half the figure belongs to the tree above ground and half to the roots. In other words, part of him belongs to the kingdom of the Heavenly Father, to the spiritual world, and part of the kingdom to the earthly mother, to the terrestrial nature. The tree depicts the unity of man with all the spiritual power and natural forces. It represents man in entire harmony with the cosmic, spiritual, and natural law. In the Essene book of creation, the 24th verse of chapter 3 is illustrated by the Essene tree of life. The tree is also the illustration to the whole of this chapter in Genesis. It is a microcosm expressing the macrocosm of the universe. It shows the full meaning of the chapter. It makes clear man's rightful place in the universe. It teaches that the fall of man described in Genesis is only an accident in the evolution of man on his path to ever higher degrees of perfection. It is the token of his salvation, the destiny, the nobility of man. Moses, Prince of Egypt, the path of tradition. There have been 4 titans in the history of mankind who have more influence on the people of the world than any other human being. These 4 are Zoroaster, Moses, Buddha, and Jesus, to name them chronologically, but the most extraordinary and enigmatic of them was Moses. Throughout universal history, a certain law has operated whenever a great civilization has seemed to be declining and close to disintegration. When the intellectual and ethical horizon of man narrows, so that no one can see clearly the way to a new start, this law operates to bring forth a universal genius who opens up a new horizon. A new cycle in the evolution of thought follows, and a new culture begins. Such a critical turning point in human history has been witnessed several times. When the Roman Empire and Roman civilization reached their peak and began to disintegrate, Jesus, the great Essene master, appeared. The ideologies of antiquity had started to fade. There seemed to be no way to go forward on the path of existing world conceptions when he came to bring a new ethic and metaphysical value to man. There was a similar situation earlier in Egypt, when the great political and cultural power became petrified and its inherent values began to disappear. Then Moses came forth, the second great titan of history. It is necessary first to survey his stature in the perspective of history in order to appreciate his extraordinary genius. He was the creator of one of 2 component parts of Western culture, the Hebrew religion. Out of that, the Greek philosophy have come the fundamental tenets of Western civilization. Moses created one of the 2 great nations to which we owe our cultural heritage. He established monotheism as the foundation of religion for all people of the Western world. He was the first and greatest of the prophets. He was the giver of the law. He brought forth the 10 Commandments, and he established the Essene communions with the natural and cosmic forces. No other single individual in history accomplished so much during a lifetime in so many different fields. His inexhaustible energy and endurance made it possible for him to perform an extraordinary variety of immense tasks. It is not necessary to analyze the life and teaching of Moses within the framework of ecclesiastical history. The significance of these have been argued back and forth down the ages. There are some historical data available, but the most authentic information comes from the ancient Essene traditions preserved through the Essene Brotherhood at the Dead Sea and at Lake Mareotis in Egypt. These traditions divide the life of Moses into 3 periods of 40 years each. The first period covered his life in Egypt from his youth until he was 40 years of age. The second period of 40 years he spent in the desert after he had fled from Egypt, and throughout that time he lived the life of a shepherd. The third 40 years he also spent in the desert leading the people of Israel after he had delivered them from the bondage of Egypt. According to the Essene teaching, each of these 3 periods had a dominant note. The first period of 40 years was spent in acquiring the sum total of knowledge available to him as a prince of Egypt, which was then the center of culture in the Western world. 3,000 years ago, Egypt was a theocratic monarchy, and the priesthood guarded the traditions and possessed the accumulated knowledge of that time. Moses followed these traditional paths to wisdom and truth. He studied all the ancient sources of Egyptian wisdom, precepts of Pra-Hotep, and the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which dated back to a period several thousand years earlier than this. The wisdom of the Egyptians represented not only their own traditions, but those that came from the East as well. Moses had an insatiable hunger for the truth, for wisdom. He was perhaps the most restless mind in all history. After acquiring the sum total of the knowledge he could find in Egypt, he reached the conclusion that he knew very little. He tried to reclaim the wisdom of Egypt from the swamps of its theognosis and theologies. He penetrated the dark labyrinth of the rituals of Isis, Amun-Ra, and Osiris, but he found only an enormous pyramid of obscure dogma and petrified traditions without inner dynamism, with no unifying principle to explain the problems of the universe and life. After 40 years of attempting to put together the innumerable bricks of the Egyptian tradition, he concluded that he would have to start on another path to find an integral explanation of the final problems of existence. After his failure to find truth on the path of traditional culture, he began to walk on the path of nature. He went into the desert and led the life of a shepherd. He observed all the phenomena of nature and tried to penetrate into the inner meaning of all that he saw. The desert became his most intimate friend. The name of Moses and the desert are inseparable. Many other great geniuses have turned to the desert. The prophets did, and Jesus did. It may be well to ask why, to ask what the desert is and what it meant to those who sought its solitude. There is in the desert something great, a vastness that transcends all superfluities. In man it is stripped down to a minimum of material necessities for the sustenance of the body, and in it he is freed from distraction for the spirit. Only in the empty places of nature, in the deserts of Arabia or the forests of India, away from all disturbing influences, did the great titans of human thought discover those inner truths which they brought forth for the benefit of mankind. From these withdrawals and meditations in the wilderness have come a long series of high values for humanity. The Avestas of Zoroaster, the Vedas of the Brahmins, the Upanishads of the forest sages of India, the Tripitaka of Buddha, the teaching of Moses, of the prophets, of the Essene brotherhood in the desert, and of Jesus. All these were the result of periods of contemplation and solitude away from the habitation of man. In the second 40-year period of life, Moses, pursuing his lowly occupation as a shepherd in the waste of the desert, sought to find that something which his intuition told him must exist behind the diversity of phenomena. He tried to penetrate into the essence of nature. It was this quest which distinguished him from the rest of mankind. Only a few make such an effort. The greatest events and the most important phenomena have often gone unrecorded or even unobserved through long centuries, despite their great influence on the life of man. The law of gravity is an instance of such an occurrence. Millions of men everywhere had seen an apple falling from a tree, but to them it was a phenomenon of no significance whatsoever. It needed the penetrating genius of a Newton to recognize a universal law and an invisible power behind that simple happening. He deduced from it the law of gravity, the law of power which governs the movement of all celestial bodies in infinite cosmic space. Similarly, Moses made a discovery even more momentous in its influence on the rest of human history, especially that of the Western world. Moses discovered the law, not a law created and promulgated by a monarch or legislative body, but a law that was the totality of all laws, the law itself. He was the first to discover that behind every phenomenon of nature is an invisible law. Then he came upon the idea of the totality of laws, and this totality he called the law with a capital L. He saw that this law was the sum total of all laws governing all manifestations of life and the universe. He made no attempt to make a minute analytical exposition of these laws as would be necessary in our present scientific civilization, but he established the notion of the one law and the notion of the embodiment of the totality of the laws governing the universe in this one law. After he had made this discovery, he determined to dedicate the remainder of his life to the realization and application of the law. His desire was to bring mankind into harmony with this law. This word law is found in the esoteric apocrypha of the Essene tradition, but in the exoteric official text of this church, the word Lord has been substituted for law. In later Essene traditions, the abstract notion of the law was always conveyed by the concrete picture of the tree. This symbolism was used in other great teachings. Buddha became conscious of the Four Noble Truths under a mango tree. Newton's awareness of the law of gravity was connected with an apple tree, and Moses similarly receiving his great revelation under a small tree in the desert, the burning bush. The tree has thus become a universal symbol, and in the Essene tradition it was known as the Tree of Life, representing the law itself. Moses, Prince of Egypt, the path of tradition. The Essene Tree of Life had 7 branches above the earth and 7 roots beneath it. Each of the 7 branches represented an invisible spiritual power, and each of the 7 roots a visible natural force. At the central point of the tree was a figure of a man, according to the archaeological finding from which in part these Essene traditions have been reconstructed. The man was represented sitting half in and half out of the earth, and in such a way that the upper part of his body belonged to the trunk of the tree and the invisible powers of the universe, while the lower part belonged to the roots of the tree and the visible forces of nature. Thus were symbolized the 2 parts of man's nature, one belonging to the material world, the other, the immaterial imponderability of his consciousness to the spiritual kingdom. According to the Essene tradition, the symbol of the burning bush, which appeared to Moses, represented two very important aspects of universal light: warmth and light. The warmth of the fire was a basic principle of the world conception found in the Zen Avesta of the Zoroaster. It stood for the fire of life, or in contemporary language, vitality. The light of the fire represented wisdom as opposed to darkness and ignorance. The lack of light represented lack of wisdom. The fire in its two symbolic aspects, the fire of life and the light of wisdom, and the tree of life, symbolizing the material and immaterial universe, together represent in microcosmic measure the macrocosm, the great universe. They express the Essene idea that man in the center of the universe draws vitality from all the forces in the cosmos. This new philosophy of life and of the universe, which was revealed to Moses in the desert, closed the second period of his life. The discovery of such an immense truth, the law of life and of the universe, was a tremendous accomplishment attained with great difficulty. But to discover such a truth and do nothing about it would even be more difficult. In Moses there burned the same fire which burned in all the prophets of Israel. They had to go forth and tell the people the truth and the law. They had to try to bring mankind into harmony with it, and to proclaim it as the greatest power in the universe, one subject to no other law or laws, one incapable of defeat. A plant, a tree, a human body, a solar system, each has its own laws, mathematical, biological, or astronomical. The totality of these laws existing behind the material universe and moving all things is eternal and indestructible. In spite of certain transitory deviation from the laws, in spite of certain temporary petrifications of this élan vital, nothing can long resist invisible universal power, this law of which Moses was the prophet. Moses' universal conception of the law was later interpreted by ecclesiastical authority as simple monotheism. Dogma after dogma was reared over the basic principles of life which he established, the fundamental truth of the law. The same thing was happened with all religions. The teaching of the first century Jesus had very little in common with the hundreds of churches and thousands of dogmas which fight each other in his name. Buddha would not recognize the superstitions of the Tibetan lamaseries, the prayer wheel, and the other practices which had been added to his profound metaphysical and ethical system of thought. Likewise, Zoroaster would be amazed at the Parsi's narrow interpretation of the fire of life, for he taught that it meant vitality and should be kept permanently burning in the hearts of men, nourished only with pure substance. But the Parsis thought he meant a visible fire, which in consequence they keep permanently burning in their homes. Moses also would be greatly surprised to learn the different dogmas and so-called miracles attributed to him. He was a unique figure of enormous stature in universal history, and no miracles were required to enhance his greatness. For he discovered the greatness of all miracles, the universal law, which shows that there are no miracles because everything in the universe operates under the one iron law of cause and effect. This discovery was greater than all the so-called miracles performed on the entire planet. The truth behind these fictitious miracles was simply Moses' penetrating mind and extraordinary powers of observation, which enabled him to see the law of cause and effect operating in every phenomenon of nature. It was for this reason that he often appeared to be a performer of miracles. When he returned to Egypt from his 40 years in the desert, he saw a gigantic empire raised on false foundation. He saw an Egypt that was built without regard to the law, despite all its political and military might. He saw the misery of the masses of the people. He saw the plagues which frequently decimated their numbers because of the lack of hygiene, because of deviations from the law of purity. He saw vast numbers of people in slavery, working laboriously because there was no law of equality in the land of Egypt. He saw a petrified religion overladen with static dogma from which the spirit had departed, a people in bondage to lifeless forms and sterile doctrines, as well as to the rules of petrified priesthood, contributing nothing new or original to the ancient static traditions, for in them was no knowledge of the law of life. The complex superstitions of all kinds which he found in the theogonies and theologies of Egypt stemmed from ignorance of the law of nature. Everywhere he saw tyranny based on force and violence holding sway over the dominant classes, the military and the priesthood, no less than over the enslaved masses. He saw that all Egypt was in slavery to ignorance of the law, and he understood that ignorance was responsible for the evils that existed. He realized that wherever there are misery and disease, epidemics and slavery, both rulers and ruled are to blame. He recognized the enormity of the task before him of trying to make both the ignorant masses and the arrogant rulers accept the law. The same obstacles confronted him which have confronted all great world reformers when the pure idea meets opposing force in the inertia of human minds and the resistance of vested interest. When Buddha taught the equality of man, he met the enormous opposition of the Brahmic doctrine of the caste system. But it was not the latter which was defeated by the beautiful ethic of Buddhism. It was Buddhism that was forced out of India to recede northward to Tibet. Moses faced the same huge obstacles, the ignorance of the masses and the caste system of Egypt. He faced the power of the Pharaoh as later Jesus faced the power of Caesar. Their attitudes, however, were somewhat different. Jesus took the position that his kingdom was not of this world, but Moses determined to establish the kingdom in this world, to make the world live in harmony with the laws at least as much as possible. When he faced the political might of Egypt, he had no power behind him but the invisible power of the law, and his own ability to understand and use the law of cause and effect to foresee phenomena which would have been unpredictable without such knowledge. His penetrating observation of nature during his 40 years in the desert enabled him to correlate all the forces and elements of nature in a way that was impossible for the priest of Egypt or Pharaoh. Moses pointed out to the pharaohs all the consequence of deviation from the law. He showed how all the misery, the epidemics, the plagues, and the series of troubles which followed the pharaoh's system of ruling were the result of continued deviation from the law. But the Pharaoh and the ruling classes of Egypt were blind to the iron logic of Moses and his predictions. Although he demonstrated the truth of his statements, he was unable to convert the whole kingdom of Egypt to the truth of the law, even as Buddha and all the other great philosophers of the world have been unable to convert the masses of the people. When Moses found that he was unable to influence the people of Egypt, he turned to another group in the country, the enslaved and oppressed people of Israel, whose ancestors had been shepherds living in another land. He had the hope of converting this minority group, and with them as a nucleus, to establish a nation based on the law. Moses himself was one of this same tribe, although he had not been brought up in it, but as a prince in the court of the Pharaoh. While he was negotiating with the Pharaoh, he attempted to organize this group of slaves into a unity. He tried to make them understand that there was another kind of life possible for them, a life of freedom lived in harmony with the law, a life incomparably more beautiful than their slavery in Egypt. But he met as many obstacles in this task as in trying to convince the Pharaoh, for the ignorance of the slaves and the ignorance of the tyrants are of the same essential character, though different in aspect. The ignorance of the tyrant is manifested in his defense of his interest and position. That of the slave is the fear of the power of the tyrant, fear of uncertainty in the new life that must follow escape from the present hardship and distress. Moses realized that his task would require a long period of re-education of all the values of these peoples whose monotonous daily lives had induced a slave mentality and a dull inertia that would be difficult to overcome. But he did not hesitate to undertake the work. Through his particular genius, his inexhaustible source of vitality and energy, his untiring perseverance, he created a new nation, and he is the only figure in universal history who has accomplished such a feat. Moreover, he wielded together a group of people whose source of value was to be entirely different from that of a downtrodden slave with whom he started upon his great mission. It is a law of nature that the cells of the human body change every 7 years and new ones take the place of the old. As a generation in the life of mankind corresponds, in a sense, to the cells in the body of the individual, so Moses undertook to change the cells of the people of Israel. It took him 40 years to do it. He undertook to renew a people in one generation, to form a new nation with a new conception of life. After spending the second 40 years of his existence in the desert as the leader of his flocks, he returned to Egypt to lead the people of Israel for another 40 years. The task occupied the third and last period of his life. That period represented the third path. In the first part of his life, he trod the path of tradition. During the second period of 40 years, he followed the path of nature. The third path was that of intuition, the path of the unfoldment of the inner consciousness through which he was able to give the law to mankind. He brought forth a new system of ethics and established a new nation. The third period began with the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. It continued through the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and it ended with Moses' final disappearance from the theater of history on Mount Nebo when he had reached the age of 120 years. Moses in the desert, the path of nature. The story of Moses in Egypt, in the Exodus in the desert, in the approach to Canaan, and the story of the giving of the laws are not limited to one particular time in universal history or even to an actual geographical locality. Their history represents something much deeper, not temporal but eternal, not limited in time and space but universal in its application and significance. It has a very deep meaning which is valid even today. It represents a revolution of the dynamic against the static, the revolt of freedom against slavery, of wisdom against superstition. It represents the global revolution of the higher value of life against the pseudo-values. For the first time in man's evolution, two diametrically opposed world conceptions came into conflict. Moses knew that in a few thousand years the great pyramids of the pharaohs, built by the labor of thousands of slaves through the centuries, would be buried under the sands of the desert. He knew that in a few thousand years mankind would not even remember the names of the pharaohs who built them. He knew that all the superstitious rituals of Isis, Amun-Ra, and Osiris, with their petrified forms, would be long forgotten. The spirit of Egypt, he knew, was based on no true reality, but was a deviation from the law, and he knew that no deviation from the law can long survive. Everything created as a result of deviation destroys itself and disappears, for it is only the law that is eternal and omnipotent. Moses stood for a conception of life entirely different from that of the Egyptians. Through his experience during his first 40 years in learning the ancient traditions as a prince of Egypt, and during his second 40 years as a shepherd in the desert, he came to the conclusion that man lives in a dynamic, constantly changing universe. He watched the movements of the stars during the long night when he tended his flocks in the desert. He saw that desert plants grow and die, and generation after generation of sheep appear and disappear. Dawns came, the rays of the sun shone upon the earth, and the sun set. The moon waxed and waned, and when he meditated he became aware of the constantly changing elements in his own consciousness. He recognized the same dynamic unity of changes and transformation in it as it continually took place in the external nature. From these observations he perceived that there is no static point either in nature or in man. Everything moves and evolves, and there is no real stagnation anywhere. When something does not actually progress, it retrogresses. The law constantly manifested itself to Moses in perpetual change, but behind these changes he saw a plan of cosmic order on a vast scale. Behind the totality of the laws of life and the universe was a supreme power. It had become evident to him that Egypt, with all its hierarchies and gigantic constructions, had no foundation in reality, since it was the product of multiple deviations from the law. Its plagues, epidemics, slavery system, and other inharmonious were the inevitable results of these deviations. Moses longed for a kingdom based only on the law, where everything would be in entire harmony with the latter. He knew that there could be nothing permanent unless it was based on the law. He had tried to convince the ruling powers in Egypt, the pharaohs and his counselors, that they ought to change the existing system, but in their ignorance and egoism they did not want to change it. Those who might have wished to change it had no power to act. Moses knew that he could organize the oppressed as others had done, and eliminate the rulers and install a new order by use of force. That would have been the path of the revolution which had dotted history, but Moses did not resort to the solution which he knew would be inadequate and impermanent. He knew that violence not only begets violence, but even becomes an end in itself. He knew there was an alternative. He could renounce his purpose and retire to the desert, there to live as a great philosopher in the belief that his teaching was enough to leave to posterity. Or again, he might decide to collaborate with the Pharaoh and hope that through progressive influence the state of things could gradually be improved. But Moses did not wish to cooperate with what he considered evil. He knew man could not serve two masters and could not accept compromise. Passivity was foreign to his nature. He was a dynamic personality, and he believed that knowledge of the law in itself was power, and that through this power he would be able to achieve his goal. Every thinking man throughout the history of mankind has faced these three same possible courses of action: force, abandonment of purpose, and compromise. Generally, one of the three may seem to be the only possible solution, but Moses considered all of them inadequate and deviations from the law. His world conception was based on a power higher than any of the three. It was based on peace, peace achieved through the omnipotence of the law. Moses had implicit confidence that by following the law, man could triumph over all obstacles through harmony with the law, and by unwavering perseverance, a goal could also be attained. He therefore chose a fourth solution, one that was unique and masterly, one that required neither armed revolution nor other violence, that called neither for enunciation of a higher ideal of life nor for collaboration with chaos and lawlessness. He struck out on a pioneering path of non-cooperation with any of the pseudo-values of life and energetic appropriation of all the true realities of existence. He planned to take with him on the path all those individuals willing to give up their false idols and accept the untried, superior truth which he felt had been revealed to him. So the Exodus began. 1,500 years later, the Essene did exactly the same thing when they abandoned Palestine and made an exodus to the desert in which they could live a life in accordance with the law. They formed their brotherhoods and abandoned the populated places where inharmony with the law reigned. They refused, along with other factions in Palestine, to collaborate with the Romans, and they did not wish to fight with armed forces. They determined to keep their own higher ideals and superior ways of life, taking with them those who were willing to cooperate with them and create a new life in harmony with the law. This was a specifically Essene solution to an ever-recurring problem, and it was inaugurated by Moses in the Exodus from Egypt. When he had made his decision, he knew he was only beginning his life work. He knew he was also beginning a long historical process. The going out from Egypt, difficult as the first step was, proved the least of all the difficulties he faced. He knew very well that his group of slaves whom he was to shepherd were too steeped in their traditional ideas and habits to be ready to understand and receive the superior truth he wished to see transmitted to mankind throughout the generations. But he continued resolutely on his course. He knew that a thing is not always equal to itself. The people of Israel were not merely a group of people unripe for the reception of higher truth. He saw in them the procreators of a new generation which would be able, by progressively increase of wisdom, to attain to full understanding of his great teaching. Therefore, what he did was not solely for the benefit of those people of Israel who had been slaves in Egypt. In them he knew he could only sow the seed of great teaching. In them he knew that he could only sow the seed of a great ideal. But he foresaw their growth and evolution through generation after generation into a people who would be obedient to the law and to the patriarch. He felt that the generation with which he started might never reach a land of Canaan, but to him these people were only a transition from the old static and discordant condition to a new dynamic and harmonious system which he was determined to establish upon the earth. Thus the Exodus was the beginning of a long period of wandering into the desert. He knew that theirs would not be the people to found his kingdom, but to him neither a kingdom nor an individual was a definite static thing created and finished. Any group or any generation of man was a living entity in constant change. Only through this dynamic method of thinking could Moses have accomplished what he did. Had he seen things only as they were, and not as they might become, he would never have been capable of finishing his vast undertaking. But he courageously faced the long series of difficulties that would inevitably arise in uprooting a people from their accustomed way of living. They would be giving up all the security they knew, miserable as it was for all kinds of uncertainties, but Moses knew they would not perish in the desert. He had lived in it for 40 years and found out how little was necessary to maintain life. All the basic preconditions of life could be supplied from the plants and the fruits of the desert and from the milk of the sheep. Their wool provided clothing and tent. It was always possible to obtain food, clothing, and shelter when living rightly and in harmony with the law. And it is never necessary to become slaves of a pharaoh or any other ruling system. Security and freedom can be had at one and the same time. They are not, in fact, divisible. A free people can enjoy freedom and the basic preconditions of life, but a slave mentality cannot, being without knowledge of the laws of nature. Moses knew that many of the groups he led toward Canaan would desire, at every difficulty encountered, to return to Egypt in their bonds of slavery, but this would be due to their old habits of inertia and ignorance. He would ceaselessly have to urge them on towards Canaan, toward the future land where he envisioned a life in harmony with the law and based on the law. At the beginning of the Exodus, freedom did not appear to these people as worse than slavery, even as Moses anticipated. They were so used to being told what to do and when and how to do it that they felt lost when they had to make their own decision. But Moses continued to exhort and encourage them. Gradually he began to train a small group in the knowledge of the law. Under the starlit skies of the desert he taught them, until little by little they became accustomed to their freedom. As the years passed, the small group gradually assimilated the teaching. As a new generation grew up, his deep, all-sided philosophy became the foundation of their daily lives. This philosophy later became the philosophy of life of that other minority group known through the ages as the Essene. Moses' teaching survived the Exodus, the life in the desert, and even the organized states of the land of Canaan. It became a dynamic factor in the history of mankind, and even more particularly in the history of Western civilization.